When you're trying to come up with an idea for a story, where should you start? Should you start with the premise or the predicament, or should you start with the main character and let the events just spill out from the character? And while arguments can be made to land on either side of this issue, it's kind of a what comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of an issue. Or in this case, what comes first, the story or the character? But we're going to talk about the pros and cons of each, and then I'm going to give you a simple 3-step strategy to help you navigate this minefield. So let's deal with the pros and cons of figuring out the story first. So pro number one of figuring out the story first is it helps you know that you have an actual story. And while a story is about someone who wants something badly, they're having trouble getting it, and they get it or they don't, so it does need a someone, right? When we talk about creating a character though, we're talking about figuring out who they are, why they tick, all kinds of things. But if you're just trying to figure out a story, the basics of the story, you don't have to really know anything about the main character except one key trait. I mean, maybe it's an archetype of a character, so the outlaw or the jester or the lover, or maybe it's their job or their obsession. A lonely toll booth operator who makes miniature models of famous murders discovers who is actually killing the Supreme Court justices, and those responsible will stop at nothing to bury the truth. I mean, you can quickly figure out if you have the core bones of a story without having to wrestle with creating characters, figuring out too many details early on. So that's pro number one of figuring out story. Pro number two, figuring out story, is you begin to figure out early on the rules and parameters of the world that you're creating. When you create a premise, one of the things that happens is you begin to start imagining scenes and moments. Your mind starts wandering as you play moments in your head, and you begin to quickly hone what you like and don't like, the vibe and feel of your story, and you can begin to shape a lot of the elements that will influence the characters that you're going to create. So using the example I just gave you, I mean, we have our toll booth worker, but a lot of toll roads, at least here in the US, are becoming more and more automated. So if we want a toll booth worker, I mean, maybe we set it at a different time where there's a bunch of them, or maybe we create a world that still has lots of toll booth workers, or maybe this is one of the few remaining toll booth workers in the country, or maybe we change them to a tax collector or a mail carrier, and it's all fine because we can figure out the world and what the world is like and what kind of people inhabit it. And what this does is it helps to ensure that any characters we end up imagining are easily going to fit into this world, so we can easily change directions because we're not locked into anything yet. Okay, it's still kind of nebulous. It's still just kind of ideas. It's a little easy to shift things. We're lighter on our feet in a sense. Now, pro number three of thinking of the story first is, as I kind of hinted at, you aren't tied to anything hardcore yet. So you can dramatically change things without feeling like you're killing off the characters that you've grown to love because you created them and you know who their 5th grade teacher is or whatever, if you do that kind of crazy thing, right? Where you're figuring all that stuff out. Yes, we can change the occupation of the main character. That's easy. But maybe they don't make actual models. Maybe it's all digital. It's a digital thing. Maybe it's not the Supreme Court justices. Maybe it's a local city council voting to bulldoze several houses for a new highway to be built. I mean, at this point in the process, we don't really have skin in the game. There's no BFF that we love that will be sacrificed later on in the story. We don't even know if we want or need them yet. We don't even know the name of our main character yet. One of the traps that writers fall into is they latch on to ideas and start drilling down and saying like, oh, this is what it's got to be too early on in the process, and they're unwilling to alter or even change that idea, even if it's a better one. So yes, a story involving Supreme Court justices might be broad and sweeping, but it's also going to involve some good car chases, lots of extras, and ultimately that's going to be a more expensive story than a story about a small town city council being knocked off one by one. And right now, honestly, in 2021, as I record this, smaller budget films are getting more play in Hollywood. So that might be the better idea, at least right now. And at this point in the idea creation process, you aren't tied to anything yet. So change it. Do what you need to do. But there are some cons to coming up with the story elements first. Con number one, and this is a biggie, the characters you create, if you get a little lazy at all, They're going to feel cookie cutter or like they were created to just serve the story. So they're going to feel really marionette-like. They're just strings. They're just doing whatever you tell them to do, instead of having characters who make choices and the story flows from those choices. You know, a key part of our definition of story is that it is about someone. And that someone has to be credible and likable, kind of, and we need to feel like everything that happens in the story is a result of decisions made by them and those around them, not something that's orchestrated by a screenwriter. And ideas that begin as story-based ideas tend to have flatter characters, or at least characters that are caricatures of real characters. And we don't want that. We want the story, once it's written, to feel organic, like it grew out of decisions that were made by the characters. Con number 2 of story ideas first is that in doing them, you are kind of locking yourself into more high concept, Hollywood-ish ideas. And maybe that's not the kind of stories that you want to write. But if you begin thinking of a premise or a predicament, the only way to communicate it at this stage is in a high concept way. Now, don't mishear me. I'm not saying high concept ideas are bad. I write them. Okay, this is the stuff I like to write. I'm saying that if you're wanting to write stories that have more of an indie feel more like an independent film, then thinking of the story idea first is going to handicap you out of the gate. And you're going to have to work a bit harder to have your story more character-driven than premise-driven. Con number 3 to creating a story idea first is, and I've fallen victim to this, is you can live in the world of experimentation for so long that you never write that story. You never get to writing it. And this does happen with a lot of writers, including me, as I just mentioned. You keep exploring and trying to figure things out, and you're not even writing anything yet. Not even a treatment. Maybe an outline, maybe some notes, but not a summary for sure, and definitely not even pages, all because you're noodling with things and trying different combinations. Well, what if this works? What if I make the main character a woman instead of a man? How does that impact things? And what like you just start figuring all this stuff out, and you just are playing the whole time, and you're never getting down to doing anything. At some point, you've got to pull the trigger and start pulling on the idea enough to see if it's going to stand up when faced with an outline. You've got to work the story through all the way to the end. And if it doesn't, that's fine. It doesn't. Move on to another idea, but stop dwelling in that abyss of all these ideas. You just got to pull the trigger at some point, like figure it out. And if it doesn't work, then reject it. If it does work, then move forward with it. But it's kind of that like fish or cut bait thing. Like you got to do one or the other. So don't dwell here. And this is a con of figuring out story ideas first. So if you're figuring out the broad strokes of a story first when coming up with a new idea, those are some pros and cons. But what about if you decide to go the other way and come up with a character first? So what are some pros for a character first idea creation? Well, pro number 1 is it ensures your protagonist is interesting on their own. And this is an important part of stories for the screen because the audience has to want to spend time with the protagonist. We don't have to like them, but we do have to find them interesting. And we have to find the dilemma that they are working through interesting enough to invest our time. And if the protagonist is interesting, then we will be more inclined to care about what happens to them on the journey they're taking. So it doesn't matter if they're likable. I gotta, at some level, care about what happens to them and be invested in them. Just think about the movies and stories that you like and consider the protagonist for a moment. I bet that protagonist is interesting to you. Probably somebody that you would want to hang out with at least a little bit. Creating characters first, pro number 2, is you know why they're making the choices that they're making. I mean, once you start spending time with your characters, you begin to understand and create their motivations and their responses to different scenarios. You know why they would act in a certain way. You know why they're going to do something, why they won't do this other thing. And this helps you create realistic choices for the story when you get to the story part, because you've figured out how the character thinks. You know how they think. You know their reasoning. You know that they're going to zig instead of zag, that they're going to go left instead of right. You know this. And in some ways, this helps you when you begin figuring out the story, because you can easily dismiss options that you know your character just would not do. At the same time, you can also force your character to have to choose to do something you know they wouldn't want to do, And this helps to show the character growth and what they're willing to do something at the end of the story that they weren't willing to do at the beginning. And in this sense, it makes your characters so much more believable because you've spent time with them. You know how they're going to decide things. You know how they're going to react. You know what they're going to do. You've spent time with them, so you know what's going to happen. And this is definitely a pro for creating characters first. Now, the third pro for creating characters first is the character arcs for your stories. They tend to be cleaner. Or maybe a better word might be more pure. Because when you think about a character, you know it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's how we are, right? We don't just change in a linear fashion. We kind of move forward and back and forward and regress and forward. And so as you're creating your character, you start to understand that. You know they're going forward, backward. Your arc is just pure. It's just so much better because you're in tune with the character. So you know how to move them through the story in an organic fashion. You know when they need some success, you know when they need some failure, and the character growth, it just feels more authentic and earned by the character at the end of the story. And audiences love it when a character earns their growth. I mean, we've seen them struggle, we've seen them fail, and then we see them finally overcome, and we're cheering for them, and we want them to learn because we want them to learn. They're finally doing it. And when they do, or even when they choose to abandon that course, we are satisfied with the character and their arc throughout the story. There are some cons, though, of creating a character first. Con number 1, you're kind of locked into your character. I mean, you've spent all this time working on them. You're figuring out their motives, what makes them tick, how they behave in situations or when stressed, and you feel like you have them nailed down. But you have them so nailed down that you're unwilling to tweak their character at all. Not because you're unable to do so, but because you've spent all this time with them, right? To you, they're a real person. And just like you can't really change other people in any forceful way, you determine that you can't change this person that you've wholeheartedly manufactured in your head. You've totally created them because to you, they are as real as you or me. Now, where this becomes a bigger problem is when you get to an impasse in your story creation, because the character you've created is going to react in a very specific way. But that's not how you need them to react in this instance or in this one moment. So the story moves in the direction you want, but if you don't change the character, you end up breaking both the character and the story, and the audience then starts to feel cheated. Con number 2 of creating characters first is all of your characters feel orchestrated as foils for your main character. It starts to come off as everything is too pretty. Everything is too neat. I mean, you've worked really hard and you've got this main character who starts off selfish and becomes selfless. So you've worked this arc, you've figured it all out, you understand why they tick and everything else. So you've got a character who's selfish, but then you also create one who is selfless. And then you create one who helps the homeless, but they don't help anyone else. And you create a character who goes to church, but who doesn't help others at all. And then there's the one whose politics are all for helping others, but they're the most greedy one in the bunch, and so on and so on. Like, everything just feels so orchestrated, so pretty, so neat. Everything is a foil to the main character. It's like everyone in the world is just there to show the varying shades of the theme or the faults and benefits of the protagonist, and you don't want that. And this results in your story feeling overly melodramatic or overly fake and ultimately kind of preachy. So the audience is going to feel like you are talking at them instead of inviting them to participate in the story. And con number 3 of creating characters first is it starts to feel like the events of the story were made for them instead of it feeling like the events of the story happened to them. And this is an important distinction because it might begin to feel like the events of the story are just there to serve the character arc instead of the character arc happening as a result of the events of the story. Just think about real life for a moment. You are a different person than you were a year ago. Might be a little, might be a lot. Why? Well, because the events that you have experienced have shaped you. The events come first, then the character growth. But if you're planning the character arc and you know it backward and forward, then when you begin to compile the story, you end up putting events in specific ways to create specific results, whether the events themselves feel like they're in a natural order or not, because you're trying to manufacture the arc of your character. So how do you navigate through all this? I mean, at first it might have seemed like I was saying, oh, story creation is good, and then maybe it's, oh, story creation is bad, and then character idea is better, but no, character is bad. And so you're like, how do I navigate this? I mean, you're supposed to figure out the broad strokes of the story first, right? Or the character first. And which one is better for you? So I want to give you a simple 3-step process to help you out when creating ideas for your stories that you want to tell. Before I do that, if you're finding value, please like, subscribe, all that stuff. I really appreciate it. If you want to help support me, there's a Patreon link below. Any support you can give, I really appreciate that. Even if it's a comment or sharing this video or any of my videos on social media, all those things really do help me out and they help others find this channel, and I really do appreciate it. Okay, a simple 3-step process. Step number 1, determine your end result first. So, if you want to write a script that you could feasibly sell if it's working on all cylinders, okay, so I kind of want to try to sell this one, okay, then you need to start in your idea needs to be a story first. If you want to write a script that you could make yourself, so you want to shoot it, okay, you love it, you want to do a character thing, you want to be a little cheaper, or you want to write a script where you could place in a contest, okay, think about character first. So many writers just come up with a random idea, they think it's great, and then they start figuring it out. But you have to consider the end result first. What do you want? I mean, if you write a script that is excellent with the idea you create, okay, so whatever it is, so you create this idea, I'm going to write this script, okay, you've got the script, it's excellent. Well, now what? What's next? Okay, so no matter how you create it, you've got to be thinking like, what am I going to do with it? What's the end result? And if you create a character that you love and then you build a story around that character, but there's nothing high concept about the premise, the world, or the predicament the character's in, okay, and you think like, oh, but I'm going to try to sell this. No, you're going to have a near impossible time getting any production company to read it. Now, it might end up placing very high in some contests because contests tend to value character stories over high concept stories. Not always, but most of the time. Don't take the wrong tactic for the result that you're after. So step number 1, figure out the end result. Step number 2, investigate multiple ideas. If you're only trying to find one idea to write and you settle on one and then start trying to write it, that's just not a good plan. It's like, oh, I need a story to write. And I think about one, I'm like, oh, that's a good one. I'm going to write that one. And then you start like, that's a bad idea. I mean, when I work with my students, I want them to come up with a minimum of 30 viable ideas, minimum. And that's before deciding which 3 or 4 they might want to explore a little further. And that's long before choosing which one to write. The first ideas you come up with tend to be cliche or cheesy anyway. After 4 or 5, you start getting to good stuff. And about 15 or 20 in, you really start letting the walls down and creating ideas and characters that are unique to you and stories that only you could write. But if you don't investigate multiple ideas, you will never tap into stories that only you can tell. So step number 2, investigate multiple ideas. You want lots of ideas. So come up with some that are maybe story-based or character-based, a mixture of both, but know what your end result is. So you choose that first, then you create a bunch of ideas off of that. So investigate multiple ideas. Step number 3, go the distance. Now, this doesn't mean you have to start running, although if you've been sitting a while after this video, be sure to stand up for a minute. What it does mean is that you can't just stop at the story or the character idea. All screenplays need both. Remember, a story is about someone, a character, who wants something badly, is having trouble getting it, and they get it or they don't. That's the story. It requires both. So whether you start with a story or with character, at some point, you're going to have to deal with the other half, and probably sooner than you think. Because if you start with a story, if you don't want your story feeling predictable and stale, you're going to have to figure out more of the main character than the fact that they're just a toll booth worker who likes making models of famous murders. I mean, what's their name? Where are they from? What's a significant event that happened to them in childhood that shaped who they are? Do they have any power? Maybe money, intelligence, prestige, all those things you need to consider when it comes to character building. At the same time, if you create a character, you're going to have them live their life at some point and make decisions that send them off in new directions and force them to choose whether they're going to change or not. So just thinking of the story or just thinking of the character is not enough. You have to go the distance and see if you have an actual story that's worth telling. Okay, the idea isn't good enough. You got to go all the way. And if you do all 3 of these, you determine your end result, you investigate multiple options, and you go the distance, you're going to be able to dig into a story that is worth telling. And it won't matter if you started with the story or with the character, because you will have done the hard work to know you have a story worth telling before you spend all that time writing a screenplay, and you're going to know what your desired outcome is going to be. And if you don't dig in, you might end up telling a story that no one wants to hear, and that would be a shame. Okay, so don't tell a story no one wants to hear. Figure out a story worth telling. Now, working on ideas, evaluating them, digging in to see if they will work as a screen story is just one piece of one thing that we cover in the Screenplay Navigator, which is my coaching program meant to transform you and others like you into screenwriters who can masterfully tell stories that matter. And in that program, we cover everything from idea creation through writing a script and revising it. It's kind of like film school in a box, done at your own pace for a fraction of film school costs. So if you're interested in transforming yourself into a screenwriter who can expertly tell stories that matter, click on the Screenplay Navigator link below to learn more and to book a free call with me. I'll answer any questions you have, and we can both see if it'll be the right fit for you. Ultimately, I want to help you become a better writer and storyteller. And if you found any value, and you haven't already, please be sure to like, subscribe, bell, all those things. I really do appreciate it. And when you go to tell a story, whether you are starting with a story idea or a character, be sure you tell a story that matters. See you later.